What's going on, everyone? So I have a massive video for today. Yesterday, or actually a couple days ago, I posted a video on my leader tier list, which a lot of you enjoyed, a lot of you watched, and a lot of you gave feedback on. And I figured because you all enjoyed kind of that tier list format about the leaders, why not do it for the best decks in Star Wars Unlimited? So what I've got here is at least one list from every single leader, their best list, the most competitive list that I have found, based on either my personal play, the tournament standings and rankings over the past couple of months. And in some cases, we have multiple versions of the same leader. For example, you might notice we have 3 Boba lists. We have 3 Sabine lists. That is because these decks, while they may not be, as good as one another, they're all very, very solid and arguably, higher tier on the list. So I'm going to be rating all these, and I've actually just completely lopped off the B tier or the D tier here because I don't think that any of these lists here are D tier. Like, they're not functional. And so I think just leaving it at C tier is perfectly fine. And you may not find your favorite list or a list that you think is actually better than whatever list I'm talking about today on the video. And if you think that's the case, let me know in the comment section down below. But before we get started, I do have a TCG player link in the description down below. If you want to pick up any cards, be sure to use that link. And I'm also going to be starting a Patreon with some exclusive benefits, maybe to get some viewer games in with all of you. So stay tuned for some news on that. Without further ado, let's dive in and talk about Boba first. And of course, we're going through in alphabetical order today. So starting us off with Boba, he is one of 3 leaders on the list with 3 different decks attached to him. Now, as we go through, I might make minor adjustments, but for the most part, where they're placed is most likely close to where they're going to be finishing on the tier list. And Boba Blue starting us off here, I think this is the weakest of the 3 Boba lists, but I don't think it's weak by any means. I think it's actually a very, very powerful list, and I would give it either low A tier or high B tier, depending on, of course, where we find all the other lists, as I'm doing this kind of as I record, not necessarily, prepping the whole list and then talking about it. So we'll see if he ends up high B tier or low A tier, but this list is pretty powerful, mainly because you get to leverage all the powerful Villainy Blue removal spells, the events that you're playing, some of the upgrades even in some cases, while being able to also leverage Boba as leader and things like Fett's Fire Spray and Boba Unit, which are all some of the highest quality units in the entire game, and in this case, leader. That, in conjunction with the action to get additional resources, can put you on top of a lot of other opponents, kind of accelerating into that mid game by using multiple removal spells in order for you to catch up if you were falling behind, or to just outpower your opponent by playing Greedos after you remove their units. Next up, we have Boba Green, and this is like the quintessential mid-range dominant list that we've seen for so very long. Boba Green is still one of the lists to beat. I don't think it's quite as powerful as it once was, simply because we're starting to see lists that are either built well against Boba Green, whereas before we were seeing a lot of like Iden Green, we were seeing a lot of Sabine aggro, Leia aggro, and in general, your aggro lists are pretty poor against Boba Green because it's able to be the more aggressive deck with the higher statted units, and that's exactly what mid-range does, right? It just plays higher value units and just outvalues you. But also, because of the ability to get additional resources readied up, you don't actually fall behind by playing more powerful units because of Boba's ability, which makes him quite very, very clearly S tier. We also have Boba Yellow, and this one's an interesting one, as I actually think it's extremely powerful as well. I think you could either put it at the lower end of S tier or the higher end of A tier. Now, I think Boba Yellow is one of the best aggro decks in the format, and it actually matches very well against opposing aggro decks if you're drawing into things like Cunning. But you could also just leverage the fact that you're playing such powerful units that also, again, similar to Boba Green, allow you to leverage the additional resources that you have. You could even do something as play 2 Cunnings in one turn, the turn that Boba comes down, which is absolutely absurd. And so this is a very, very interesting deck list, but it does struggle in a lot of cases against the newer lists that we're starting to see, some of the controlling lists, as unfortunately with Boba, one of the things that Boba requires in order for his leader abilities to even be used is opponents' units. And these more hard control lists, Boba ends up not being able to leverage those additional resources. And it's one of the reasons why Boba Blue and Boba Green and Boba Yellow perform not as oppressively against these hard control lists. However, Boba Yellow is extremely powerful and one of the best aggro decks in the format. And honestly, I think that it is deserving of a lower S tier rather than the same tier as the A tier Boba Blue. That is just how powerful I view Boba in general. And well, starting off with Boba puts us a lot of decks in the higher tiers, but it's not going to stay like that forever, I promise. We're going to get some more lower tier decks on the list. But if you're looking to play competitively in any sort of event, I think bringing any flavor of Boba is going to put you in a good position. But I think Boba Green and Boba Yellow in particular are the strongest of the Boba flavors that we have at the current moment. Next up, we have Cassian Yellow, which is, well, a pet deck of one of our designers in Star Wars Unlimited, Danny Schaefer, which a lot of people have tried to adapt and play on their own terms. Now, this is basically the same list as Sabine Yellow, but with, in my opinion, a weaker leader. And, well, I don't even know if it's necessarily my opinion, as they just haven't performed as well as Sabine Yellow. We've seen Sabine Yellow, perform top tournaments and get into the top 8, whereas Cassian Yellow hasn't really performed as well. And so I think it's pretty fitting to put Cassian Yellow at the lower end of B tier or even the higher end of C tier, as you kind of just have the same makeup. You have the same red 3s, the A-Wings and such that you're playing in Sabine Yellows or even other heroism decks. You're also playing Surprise Strikes, in some cases Greedos and things like that, Rogue Operatives, Millennium Falcons, all very strong units. But your leader is just kind of mediocre, as the extra cards that you draw generally isn't what you want to be doing with those cards in your deck. You just want to be forcing in damage as you can. And as such, I think Cassian ends up in the lower end of B tier, simply because if you're looking to play competitively and you're looking at these lists, well, not only just Cassian, because he comes down at 6 resources, make the deck a lot weaker, you also just have a straight up upgrade according to tournament analytics in Sabine Yellow. So I think he is in the B tier for a clear reason. Next up, we have Chewie Green, which is a list that I find very, very annoying to fight against. Not because it's particularly amazing, but because of all the Sentinels. If you're trying to get in damage, it can actually stall you out quite frequently. And the nice thing about Chewie is, while he is a late to deploy leader in 7 resources, similar to Darth Vader, you do get a powerful leader on the flip side. A 2/9 Sentinel Grit is very powerful, and it's one of the reasons why Chewie is played at all. Because his action, while the Sentinels can be annoying in the early game, to be fair, you're just playing in what all intents and purposes is just a weaker Luke Green list, as you're playing very much the same cards, but with, in some cases, a more powerful leader on the flip side, but with a weaker one on the front side. And so I think that Chewie ends up in the B tier. I do find him to be slightly better than something like a Cassian Yellow, straight up because of how powerful Chewbacca can be when you do flip him. The thing is, yes, he can still die to power of the dark side, but that's basically the only thing that can take him out. Otherwise, you're just going to trade in multiple units into this guy, and upgrading him makes him an absolute nightmare, because he's one of the only Sentinels that can't actually just be cleanly dealt with something like an Avenger or something like a Vanquish or even something like a Takedown or something of that nature, because he's just that powerful. And, well, if you've seen how powerful something like a Childson is against an aggro deck, if you're ever able to get to 7 resources in the aggro matchup, you just get Chewie out, and he has an absolute brick wall that starts to destroy your opponent for chunks of, well, I've seen, again, things like 13 to 14 damage on a single swing with Chewbacca. So not insane, but his leader does give him some merit in the later stages of the game, and I think he ends up in somewhat of the middle B tier to higher B tier. Next up, we have Chirrut Red, the Force Aggression list, and I think this ends up in a solid lower A tier on the list. We've seen Chirrut quite frequently. We've seen him played in tournaments. We have not really seen Chirrut perform on the tournament level. We've seen things like even Chewie Green perform better than a Chirrut Red list. The thing is, it consistently performs to a point where it actually is a threatening deck. It just can't go all the way generally. And part of the problem is that when you start to get to sideboarding and you start to know what your opponent's playing, you can really mess up your opponent. Your aggro decks bring in 3 copies of Disabling Fang Fighters, but you might even bring in Confiscates. Sometimes they have aggressions if they're playing double red, or if you're playing a control deck, well, you know exactly what to prepare for, and you could bring in removal spells to deal with these upgraded units, and you can oftentimes just get 2 for 1 over and over and over again. On top of that, you can also sculpt your hand to where you aren't getting blown out by things like Force Throw, It Binds All Things, The Force is With Me, etc. On the other hand, in the aggro matchup, this does do really well in game 1. It's one of the things that just really makes it one of the most solid or more solid decks, as in game 1, your opponents don't really have anything to deal with all these upgrades coming in unless they're playing main deck Fang Fighters and things like that. And so it does end up performing quite well, and it is powerful, especially if you're just able to upgrade Chirrut, as he's one of the units that is kind of less able to be removed. And if you go all in, you can do some really massive damage, as he still is the cheapest to deploy Force unit, and that makes him one of the most powerful kind of combo leaders for Force synergies, and I do think he ends up in the lower A tier. Grand Inquisitor is unfortunately a lot worse in terms of Force synergies, and I'm gonna have to put him probably at the lower end of B tier, slash, in the middle of B tier in general. Now, what's interesting about this is I found Grand Inquisitor to be a very powerful aggro deck, and you can do some really nice things with Grand Inquisitor. The problem with Grand Inquisitor is that you oftentimes can't close out the game because you don't have the heroism cards that allow you to deal direct damage. Like Chirrut, for example, we haven't even talked about other like actual heroism aggro decks that involved green or yellow besides Cassian, but both Cassian and Chirrut have things like K2SO for a cause to rely on. I should say for a cause I believe in to rely on closing out the games for them. Grand Inquisitor just relies on units and getting them ready immediately. And if you control the board against Grand Inquisitor, it is a real nightmare to ever close out a game. Not only that, but you also have much lower quality units in the villainy side of things than heroism, and you just have a hard time pumping in a lot of damage in the later stages of the game. I've tried to get this guy to work, and he does do decently, but he doesn't really perform at tournaments, and he doesn't really perform against some of the top tier meta decks that we've seen so far. So we've talked about quite a few one-of decks, as I don't really think a lot of these leaders have more options available to them in terms of trying to be a little bit more competitive. But we do have 2 here for Han, as we've seen both Han Green and Han Red end up in the top spots at some of the tournaments. Now, between the 2, I find Han Green to be by far the better deck. Han Green is kind of your mid-range heroism side of things, similar to Luke Green, but instead of leveraging just removal spells and trying to get to the middle of the game, you get to leverage the additional resource cheating that Han gives you with his actions, allowing you to accelerate into things like U-Wing reinforcements, traitoresses, home ones, or even just playing early game cards such as Ezra on turn 1 to recoup the card disadvantage that Han brings you. This is a very powerful list, and I do think it solidifies itself at the middle to the top of A tier as one of the more powerful mid-range decks in the format. Han Red, on the other hand, is a little bit more aggressive, as you get to play kind of the same shell that Cassian Yellow and Sabine Yellow are playing. However, instead of drawing the cards potential or just straight up direct damage in an early resource leader deploy, you get the ability to play your cards potentially a turn earlier, and that can be powerful. The unfortunate part about this is you oftentimes need a certain amount of cards to actually close out the game in heroism. Like, you can't just play your above card cards every single turn and expect to win, because you'll run out of cards before you do so, right? If you go turn 1 Ezra, or let's say turn 1 Millennium Falcon, turn 2 K2SO, that's a pretty good curve, but unfortunately for you, it's not normally going to end up in a win, as it's just not powerful enough to close out the game. If you do go turn 1 Ezra and a turn 2 K2SO, it can do some major work, but I think this ends up in a little bit more of the B tier, and I put it at the higher end of B tier. It's still powerful, it can still do some major work, but it's not quite as good as a Han Green that we've seen finish very frequently in top spots in recent tournaments. Next up, we're going to talk about Hera, and unfortunately, Hera here is the first list that I'm going to put in the C tier. Here's the thing about Hera. The double green version of Hera is the list that I've seen the best list. I've tried Hera Red. I think I made a video on it. I've tried Hera Blue. I've tried Hera Yellow. The thing with Hera in all these different colors is the only aspect that doesn't have a Spectre unit in it is command. And Hera herself is command. And so by running double command, you are able to run command the event at 4 resources, which is pretty impressive. Love that. And you kind of want to leverage the more powerful events if you can, because of Hera's ability giving you, the only thing it gives you is the ability to play cards in other aspects. The idea is you play double command, you get to leverage the more powerful events in command and potentially like attack pattern delta, which is a powerful event, although it sometimes doesn't work out. And then you get to play things like Sabine, Kanan, Chopper, Ezra, Zeb, if you wish, Spark Rebellions, without any aspect penalty. And then you get to still play Battlefield Marines and things like that. The problem with this is that despite command being a powerful event, you are just playing, in general, kind of a conglomeration of cards that don't really match together super nicely, right? For example, Kanan and Ezra, or Kanan and Sabine, kind of do 2 different things. Kanan is a more mid-rangey, try to heal you up and return back from kind of getting behind early against the aggro decks, whereas Sabine gets in for early damage and tries to hit your opponent pretty hard. And unfortunately, that's kind of how the entirety of the Spectre Force feels like, is some of them match together and some of them don't. And in general, this ends up being just a weaker overall deck than a lot of the Heroism aggro decks, and a weaker mid-range deck if you're trying to go mid-range than Luke Green or Han Green that you can potentially play. And so, unfortunately, it's going to end up in the C tier for today. One of the big things that harms Hera actually as well, not only is her leader ability non-existent, essentially, but the backside of her, the flip side, having a 4/6 come down at 6 resources and not really doing too much else is, yeah, getting experience token to some unique units can be decent. It's oftentimes just too late, as your unique units have either died or you're already going way too deep in terms of, well, losing HP on your base. Next up, we got to talk about Iden, and this is the second one on our list that has 3 deck lists available to her. Now, I think all these are actually extremely powerful. It's one of the reasons why we have 3 of them. You might notice the leaders that are really good have 3 deck lists available to them. Who knew? Who knew? Right? But Iden Blue, Iden Green, and Iden Red are all extremely, extremely popular decks. I'd say that the Iden Red list is the least popular because it's kind of just Vader Blue, but with Iden instead of Vader, which makes it a little bit weaker in my opinion, and from what we've seen on tournament finishes. However, I think the strongest of these 3 is a toss-up between Iden Blue and Iden Green. It's hard to say which one ends up more strictly in the S tier, but I think more recently, Iden Blue has shaped up against the meta a little bit better than Iden Green has. And the main reason for that is being able to leverage a 4-cost Vigilance and playing main deck Spark Rebellions, which technically any deck can do, but because you're playing double blue Iden, you play those in place of other cards that oftentimes in other aspects you would have played for villainy decks, gives you a really good game against Control. And Control is a very, very big kind of flavor of the month in which everyone's starting to play things like Iden Blue, things like Vader Blue, things like Boba Blue, things like Iden Green, Krennic Green. These are soft control lists, but we're playing a lot more Control, and Iden has a really, really good game 1 and game 2 after sideboarding against Control. It's just favorable all around. Not only that, but also Iden Green, one of the big things with Iden Green is that, well, Boba ends up being a pretty favorable matchup into Iden Green as, well, let me make myself clear. Boba is favored in the matchup against Iden Green because Iden Green tends to play a lot of units, well, that Boba gets to kind of take advantage of and leverage the additional resources, which is pretty powerful. So I'm gonna have to put Iden Blue in the S tier here, as I've been really impressed with it. But I also think that Iden Green can end up in the S tier as well. I think both are extremely powerful. So maybe it's fair enough to put Iden Green at the top of A tier and put Iden Blue into the S tier category, as well. I think that both are very, very powerful, but I think that Iden Green is a little bit weaker. And then as for Iden Red, I also think it is an A tier deck, and I think it's a little bit more powerful as a controlling list than Boba Blue. Iden Blue and Iden Red are typically the hard control lists, and then Iden Green is the more soft control slash mid-range style of deck. And, well, it's just that they're all three very powerful. Iden herself is a really powerful leader to get you to the later stage of the game against aggro. And that applies to every single one of these lists, as they're all running removal spells, since you're running Vigilance as your main aspect, because Iden herself is Vigilance. And depending on how you pair, well, gives you a little bit more favorable matchups in some and weaker in others. So I think they end up overall across A and S tier similar to Boba Fett. Who knew? Next up, we have IG88 Green. Now, this one is a list that I've seen a couple people advocate for very frequently. They've been really excited about it. They're like, guys, IG88 Green is where it's at. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say that he ends up in C tier. I played a lot of IG. I played a lot of Star Wars Unlimited in general, but I played a lot of IG, both against IG and with IG. And the problem with IG Green here is, for one, you don't get to play the powerful, cunning villainy cards that makes Boba Fett so powerful. Boba Fett himself, the leader, the unit, as well as things like Fett's Fire Spray, Greedo. These are all extremely high value units that you don't get in red villainy. But you also want to pair it with green, as arguably green villainy has more powerful units. Vader, Overwhelming Barrage, things like that. Heck, even like Resupply, Super Laser Attacks. The other thing is IG himself as a leader dies almost every time he comes down on 5 resources. I've played against IG88 a lot as Vader Blue, and with Vader Blue or Iden Red or anything like that, you have things like Open Fire and Force Choke that kill IG. You have takedowns and sometimes Power of the Dark Side. You have Vigilance, which can oftentimes, kind of clear the way and make up for any HP lost, which IG's trying to be more aggressive. And because you're getting your units removed all the time, you can't even leverage his front side action ability. So unfortunately for IG, he just doesn't match up well against the top meta. Like Boba Green is very, very good against IG88. Boba Yellow is very good against IG88. And, well, the control decks oftentimes are able to just remove IG before he does anything whatsoever threatening, which is a little bit unfortunate. So, gonna end up in the C tier for me, but I know some people are gonna disagree with that one. Let me know in the comment section down below. Next up, we have Jyn Erso, and unfortunately for Jyn, I would view Jyn as arguably the weakest deck out of the heroism yellow-red combinations that we've had, right? We have like Han Solo on the list, we have Cassidy on the list, and we have Sabine Yellow coming up soon. And unfortunately for me, the way I view Jyn is her value trade potential in her front side action is not at all what you want to be doing in heroism yellow. In this case, it's yellow red, but in yellow red heroism. Cassian at least gives you the potential to draw into some more powerful units, such as K2SO for a cause, and try to go a longer game by getting a lot more direct damage in your hand. Sabine just straight up has direct damage and an earlier to deploy leader. Jyn has neither of those things, and the whole goal is for her to kind of trade into opponents' units and keep your units around. The problem with this is that oftentimes you won't be able to go ahead and trade with your opponent's units because they've gone with a different arena, or they're playing a soft control / hard control list and her action is completely worthless. On top of that, because of her being a later to deploy leader, you really can't kind of stabilize the board much easier against things like, well, Sabine, which is exactly the same list, except you're playing Jyn instead of Sabine. So unfortunately for me, I found Jyn to be one of the weakest lists across the game, and I found, Jyn just not be that great. However, if you ever play Limited, guys, Jyn, that is a list. I've played Jyn so many times in Limited, and she is extremely powerful in Limited. Next up, we have Krennic Green, and this list, in my opinion, and from what we've seen overall in the tournaments, has just been weaker than Iden Green. It's basically the same list. You're running the same sort of vigilance, command, villainy package. You're running overwhelming barrages. You're running Darth Vaders. You're running your Death Troopers. You're running your Viper probe droids. Your vigilance is oftentimes in your main decks at this point. And in a lot of cases, you're just getting a weaker leader. Despite Krennic being deployed a turn earlier, potentially, than Iden, the front side of Krennic doesn't really want, or I should say, doesn't really have to do with what the soft control decks are trying to do, right? Damaging your units and getting an extra power, great. That's great if you're trying to kill your opponent's units and then attack their base and get in for lots of damage. So it can be somewhat useful. However, generally speaking, these soft control lists just straight up trade units in the early game and then use their more powerful units or events in the later games to kind of come back and finish it out. And that's where Iden comes in, because Iden is guaranteed to restore you a lot more HP than Krennic will, assuming Krennic doesn't just get to roam free and attack a bunch of times, as he does have that restore too. Not only that, but also because of the shielded on Iden, you oftentimes can get Iden deployed and not have her die immediately, which allows you to use Overwhelming Barrage, which otherwise you might not have been able to. Something like Krennic has a really weak Overwhelming Barrage, which is really important because that's one of the cards that kind of brings you back in the game. And having a guaranteed unit that generally won't die, if they have takedowns and stuff, they're playing Vigilance, which means you probably don't need Overwhelming Barrage. But if they don't have takedowns and things like that, and they're playing an aggro deck, guess what? Overwhelming Barrage comes in and is clutch with something that's shielded. And so, unfortunately, Krennic is just a weaker version of Iden Green as far as we've seen. Next up, we have Leia Red, and this is my favorite deck of the entire Star Wars Unlimited meta tier list that we have here, just because it's the first deck I built in person, and she is some of the most fun I've had in Star Wars Unlimited, just because of how much burst damage you can deal with Leia. It is unlike any other lists in the entire game in terms of a single action dealing X amount of damage. The thing with Leia Red here is that you have the same package as Sabine Red, or Sabine Green rather. You're playing your Battlefield Marines, you're playing your K2SOs, you're playing your Four Causes, you're playing your straight up full Rebel synergies, right? The thing with Leia, compared to Sabine, is that you can action cheat with Leia. And that actually gives you an advantage, generally speaking, in the aggro mirror, which is really important. It's weaker against control decks, and in some cases mid-range decks, but it's better against aggro decks. And so that's something you need to consider. Add to that you have a more powerful leader. She is one of the few 5 to deploy leaders that actually attacks for 4 damage, right? If you look at what we got right now in the game, we have things like Tarkin, who attacks for 2, Krennic that attacks for 2. We have things like Chirrut, who attacks for 3. Guess who only attacks for 4? We have things like IG and Boba Fett. Unfortunately for us, Leia also fits in that category. So she's actually quite a beefy leader that can't get taken down immediately, which is really important. And it can't get killed immediately because it doesn't have 4 toughness like IG, while also attacking for a lot and allowing you to action cheat, which makes things like General Dodonna much more powerful of a leader, because instead of playing him and getting in like 1 attack, which generally happens, you can play him and get in like 2 or 3 attacks with things like Rebel Assault, right? I can't tell you how many turns or how many games I've gone deploy Leia with a General Dodonna on the battlefield on that turn, right? So I go General Dodonna, Leia, right? And then I have like 2 other units on the battlefield. I go Rebel Assault, attack with all 3 of the units, defeat the opponent. That absolutely wins a ton of control matchups. And that's where Leia ends up in the middle of A tier. Luke Green is up next, and it's pretty comparable to Han Green in that they're kind of the same style of deck, but with different approaches to it. Both are mid-range. Both are trying to leverage Ewing reinforcements. There are later gameplays like Home 1. However, the way Han does it is by using Cunning's trickery and trying to accelerate with a long-term loss. Luke, on the other hand, is trying to stall, value trade, and heal up in order to get to that later game. And so, depending on who you're fighting and where you're evaluating these decks, I think they're both very similar, but I would give the edge to Han Green. We've seen more Han Green lists make the top 8s over the course of time, but also the nature of a lot of these decks ends up that Han ends up just being able to leverage their more powerful events and units earlier on and being able to close out the game and win at a much quicker pace than Luke Skywalker is. I do think this is going to change in the next set. I do think Luke's going to get a big bump. And so, again, I think that where you place these guys really depends on what your meta has been and where you're using each of these lists. But I think they're very comparable, and I do think that Han takes a little bit of an edge here, although I've been really impressed with Luke because I've been playing a lot of Luke lately. Next up, we got Palp Blue, and this is a list that I've been really enjoying lately, as it is the control hoser. If you want any list to beat hard control, you want to play a control deck yourself, you want to have ramp, because you can ramp into your spells or your events earlier than other control decks, and you want to have a massively powerful leader. Guess what? Palp, check, and it's going to end up in the high B tier. I don't think it ends up any higher than that. You can, well, maybe I should say, maybe it's a little bit better than something like Force Chirrut, and maybe I should make the swap to put kind of Chirrut Red in the higher end of B tier and Emperor Palpatine the low end of A tier. Here's the thing with Emperor Palpatine. You struggle a good amount against the aggro decks. You just get run over. Unlike Vader, unlike IG or Iden, you don't have, or even Boba, you don't have a lot of the earlier game potential, either removal spells, healing, or leader deploys in order for you to kind of stay alive. Vader, you have an action that can pick off units early in the game. You also have aggression available to you, so it gives you open fire and force chokes. Iden has things like, well, the ability to heal, as well as you're able to play some of the leaders and such in combination with some of the options that you have earlier on, which is quite nice. And even in Bobo, guess what? You have a really powerful leader, also additional resources to leverage, which gives you the advantage in a lot of those situations where you could play multiple removal spells in a turn. But Emperor Palpatine is so good against the control decks, and it's gotten better and better. And so you might see this climb a little bit higher. The more popular control gets, the more popular, or better, I should say, that Emperor Palpatine Blue gets, which is pretty impressive. We've seen Emperor Palpatine compared to something like, let's say, Idens or Bobas or anything like that. Guess what? Emperor Palpatine hasn't really kind of gotten to those top 8s as frequently, but it has more recently, especially since we're starting to see more Vader Blues and such things like that come into the meta. And we have our last group of 3 from Sabine coming in. And unlike Iden or Boba, who has like maybe one outlier, I think that all 3 of these lists are very comparable. And while Sabine Green edges it out as the best, I do find that both these other lists, Yellow Sabine, Double Red Sabine, both have advantages that Sabine Green does not have. Here's the thing with Sabine Green. It has the ability to compete in a lot of these matchups because of ECL. It makes it such a powerful deck in order to leverage things like Steadfast Battalion, K2SOs, getting in for damage, and maybe even trading with your opponent's unit, but not sacrificing damage to the base. And this is really an important kind of concept. When you ECL something out and you get a good trade with your opponent, yes, technically you could have done that by playing K2SO, waiting for the next turn and attacking and doing the same thing. The thing is, you have sacrificed that damage to your opponent's base, and that's what's so good about Sabine and ECL. However, I do think Yellow Sabine also ends up in the S tier. Yellow Sabine has been really impressive lately, and it's mainly because Spark Rebellion is such a powerful card against the control decks. In order for you to kind of set this up, you need to be kind of in a certain turn. Let's say you go turn 1, blah, 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 turn 2, blah, blah, blah. You're fighting Iden Blue. Turn 3, you have the initiative, and you steal their vigilance from their hand with a Spark Rebellion. That is their most powerful card. And no matter what you would have done, that is way better for you to trade your resources to save 5 HP from what they could have healed and the potential for defeating your units. It is extremely powerful. Or even waiting till turn 7 when they're going to Super Laser Blast and Spark Rebellioning it out of their hand after they go search your feelings or whatnot. That is what makes Sabine Yellow so much more powerful against the control options, but it also works good against the Boba decks above us as Cunning, nice to take that away out of their hands, overwhelming barrages, and things like that. Spark Rebellion is just such a powerful card. On top of that, you get to leverage things like Millennium Falcon, Surprise Strikes, and a bunch of other things that really work well in the Cunning aspect. Sabine Yellow ends up in S tier. And then Sabine Red, I think, is also a very high tier deck. If you haven't played with Sabine Red lately, you should probably go back and try it again, as there are two cards, Saw and Aggression, that make this list so much better than what we were playing with in the earlier days of the format. Why? Because Saw Gerrera is super good against control decks. It's really good against getting them early damage or direct damage to their base, just like a K2SO. And then Aggression helps you against the control decks as well as the aggro decks, because against the aggro decks, you get to defeat something and ready up something, so it gets to get in for damage. Against control decks, you get to potentially draw cards, defeat something, or defeat an upgrade, so Entrenched, for example, which gives you a unit back, essentially. And that gives you a lot of game against multiple different matchups, and it makes it so much more powerful of a deck from what we were doing before, when we're seeing Entrenched, Traitoresses, and multiple different other upgrades, such as, well, you're fighting against Cheer Red, you get to defeat Jedi Lightsabers. These are things that are really powerful, and Sabine Red ends up being a really powerful list in the A tier. Maybe you could argue she should be behind, the mid-rangey decks, but I definitely think she actually matches up better than Leia Red, even though they're both kind of the same lists, except, well, I shouldn't say same list. They're the same strategy. Sabine just does it better. She always has. So A tier for sure. Next up, we've got Grand Moff Tarkin, and I think this one's a pretty simple one. I'm going to put him in the middle of B tier. This guy's always been somewhat of a reasonable list to run. I like the kind of trooper aggro Tarkin list, but I also like the mid-rangey Tarkin list. Here's the thing with Tarkin is green is a great color. Command is a great color. No doubt about it. Pairing it with blue is arguably the best thing to do alongside Command Villainy. Well, maybe not since Boba exists, but that's because Boba leader. But generally speaking, Command Villainy and Vigilance is the way to go. But with Tarkin, pairing Tarkin with Vigilance doesn't really do what you want to do, which is get down early units and give them experience tokens. Unfortunately, Vigilance is all great for its removal options, generally speaking. So you run red, and Aggression Villainy is just very, very weak in comparison to a lot of other options that we have. Maybe that's why Grand Inquisitor and IG-88 are also down here. But also, maybe Vader's going to be a little bit higher. But that's because the units in Aggression Villainy aren't that strong compared to having a lot of options in, let's say, Cunning, such as Boba Fett, Bossk, Fett's Fire Spray, etc. You don't have those massive powerhouses with the exception of Emperor Palpatine, and Emperor Palpatine doesn't really fit all that great in a Tarkin list. So I think he ends up in the middle of B tier. Next up, we have some control decks, a control deck, and then some more control decks in Thrawn Blue. I've tried to make this guy work a lot. I don't think he shapes well in the meta oftentimes. I think you could put him near the bottom of B tier or the higher end of C tier, but I do think that he ends up as a reasonable control deck, but just weaker than all the other control options that you have. And that's where I would put him. Things like Krennic, who's a soft control list, just ends up being able to deal more pressure to your opponent. Palp, able to go longer and have more powerful reasons to get to that late game. Boba Blue gives you that same color combination that Thrawn has, but instead of having a 3/9 on 6, you have a 4/7 on 5 and the ability to leverage additional resources. One of the problems with Thrawn is the fact that his exhaust potential isn't able to be kind of recovered. And what I mean by that is exhausting units is great. It saves you HP without the forcing you to use a removal spell, right? The problem with that is that you need a way to catch up. Super Laser Blast is the way to catch up. There's only 3 of them in the deck. If you don't have Super Laser Blast, Thrawn ends up being a lot weaker than you might otherwise think. And unfortunately for us, that's why he ends up at the lower end of B tier. Lastly, we have Vader. And in my opinion, as well as what we've seen over the course of Vader being introduced to a lot of the tournaments, Vader has performed exceptionally well, both Vader Green and Vader Blue. And in terms of how the matchups roll, he has, in general, more powerful and favorable matchups because of how the meta shapes up. There are a lot of people still playing Boba Green. There are a lot of people playing Boba Yellow. There are a lot of people playing Sabine Green. And while I think Iden Blue has a slightly favorable matchup, or maybe even a little bit more than a favorable matchup, depending on how your list is run, if you're running 3 Spark of Rebellions in main deck, it actually does do well against Darth Vader Blue. That deck isn't played as much. And because Boba Green and Sabine Green are played so frequently still, Darth Vader ends up in the top of the food chain. Against Boba, Boba has no way to leverage its additional resources because you have no units to remove. Against Sabine, you have way too many ways to heal, including main deck potential devotions, repairs, and vigilances, as well as a slew of resources in order to remove your opponent's units, such as open fires, forced chokes, and more importantly, you're able to close out the game very quickly as soon as you get to turn 6, turn 7, turn 8. Or even sooner than that if you have a really nice Child Sin draw. Putting down Child Sin, you can actually just race your opponent's Sabine. If you get to Vader and Super Laser Blast, you get to Super Laser Blast, flip over Vader, and suddenly you control the battlefield and are able to close out the game. And that's what makes Vader so powerful. His combination of having a very strong leader flip while also having a relevant action ability in the front. And don't forget, you just have to play a villainy card. You can take things out like Wing Leader and even do some additional damage to opponents' units by just playing villainy cards, which is really, really powerful. Vader Green, on the other hand, is a much different flavor of Vader, as it's not really a control list. It's more of a mid-range list. And in fact, I'm gonna have to put Vader Green at the top of A tier, even better than Iden Green. And the main reason for this is what you'll find with Vader Green is that it just has so many powerful mid-range threats that you could easily ramp into. Things like Relentless, which are really good against control decks. Darth Vader, also good against control decks, but also really good against aggro decks. You have things like Super Laser Tech Resupply to get you there. And you also have a lot of the kind of aggression backup that you kind of want. Emperor Palpatine's potentially main deck. You have Darth Vader himself that flips over and really controls the board. And even in some cases, some removal spells. This is a very powerful list and is the best mid-range list in villainy with the exception of Boba Fett, depending on how you view Boba Green, which might even be a more mid-range tempo list. But that's going to wrap up Vader. And there are all the deck lists. Now, what you might notice if you watch that leader tier list video is that a lot of the leaders are kind of in the same places as where the deck lists are. Why is that? Because those leaders are good, causing their decks to be good. There might be some differences as you have to view the leaders in terms of what they're capable of across all their deck lists. Whereas in this list, I've just kind of pulled the most popular competitive lists. Either they were seen in tournaments or are talked about quite frequently. There are things like, for example, if you wanted to play Han Blue, not on the list, or, Vader Yellow or Boba Red. These things are not on the list, but that's because they're not nearly as strong and they're not really seeing a lot of tournament play. Whereas basically all of these lists, with the exception of the lower ones, such as like Jin and Hera and IG, like, yes, these are just the best lists that you have for these decks, for the leaders. It is what it is. But for the most part, everyone else on the list has seen a little bit of competitive play. And if you're comparing it to the rest of Star Wars Unlimited, like, these are good decks. All of them are reasonable decks. Like, if someone showed up with Hera double green, I'd be like, yeah, I gotta play. Like, I can't just ignore it. Or IG green, yes, it is a deck. It's not great. These are not great decks, but they are reasonable. And they can definitely take games off. So they're not laughable, unlike some other lists that you could talk about that are not on the list. But if you disagree with anything on this list, let me know in the comments section down below. There's bound to be some disagreement, and I'm definitely interested to hear what you have to say. Just keep it civil, which you all normally do. And again, thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to pick up any of the cards here, use my TCG Player link in the description down below. And I will see you all for a video tomorrow.